The valet takes my keys, and I'm already regretting this. The entrance to the summit hall in Geneva glows with that particular kind of wealth that makes you check your reflection twice. Not out of vanity, but to ensure your armor is intact. I smooth down my navy blazer. It is a garment of clean lines and professional discipline, purposely devoid of the flashy logos favored by the men inside. I didn't come here to impress anyone, or to announce my net worth with a diamond-encrusted watch. I came because Theo Whitmore called in a favor, and in this world, a debt to Theo is a debt you pay without question. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of expensive cologne, and the hushed tones of deals worth billions being brokered over crystal tumblers. I scan the foyer for Theo's assistant, the one tasked with briefing me on my role as a strategic observer for the afternoon sessions. My phone buzzes in my palm. A text, running 20 minutes late. Grab a seat near the west wall of the lounge. You'll know the table. I begin to weave through the clusters of tailored suits and silk gowns, and that's when I see him. Victor Kane, my ex-husband, is standing near the bar with 3 other men, throwing his head back as he laughs at a joke he likely told himself. His hand rests on a glass of scotch with proprietary grip, as if he owns the very air in the room. Perhaps, in his mind, he does. Our divorce was finalized 2 years ago, clean, quick, and devoid of courtroom drama. It was a quiet kind of ending that happens when one person decides you're a small thinker who doesn't fit the empire they intend to build. His eyes catch mine. The laugh dies on his face, replaced by a look I remember all too well, one that catalogs a person's value and dismisses it in the same breath. I don't stop walking. I don't change direction. I head toward the table Theo mentioned, feeling Victor's stare follow me like a physical weight against my back. Aria. I turn. He's already crossed half the room, his stride confident and predatory. I didn't know you'd be at an event of this caliber, he says, though his tone suggests he thinks I'm here to serve the drinks rather than observe the holdings. Business. I reply simply. He glances at my blazer, his lip curling just enough to show his disdain for my lack of flash. Business, right? Still keeping things modest? Which little firm are you assisting these days? I could tell him the truth. I could tell him that I am the architect of the very acquisitions he's been chasing for months. Instead, I maintain my patient, analytical mask. Enjoy your evening, Victor, I say, and I take my seat. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom hummed with the vibration of 1,000 quiet, high-stakes conversations. I move through periphery, my movements as fluid and invisible as the capital I managed. The light from the crystal chandeliers didn't just illuminate the room. It seemed to polish the egos of every man in a 4-figure suit. I scanned the clusters of guests, looking for a sign of Theo's assistant, but my eyes were pulled, almost magnetically, toward the center of the circular bar. There he was, Victor Kane. He didn't just occupy space. He demanded it, standing with a practiced, expansive posture that signaled he was the ambitious sun around which this particular solar system orbited. He was surrounded by a phalanx of seasoned investors, men who usually guarded their attention like a state secret. Yet they were leaning in, hanging on his every word. I watched in the shadows of a fluted pillar as he gestured with a crystal tumbler, the amber liquid catching the light as he spoke of disruptive expansion and aggressive scaling. A ripple of laughter erupted from his circle, and I saw Victor beam, that same charismatic, status-obsessed smile that used to make me feel like I was part of something grand, before I realized I was merely a supporting character in a biography. He was a man of the hour, the corporate alpha, whose name was whispered with a mix of envy and reverence across the floor. It became clear that he wasn't just another guest. He was the primary speaker for the night's keynote panel on emerging markets. The irony was a cold weight in my chest. Victor was performing for the room, selling a vision of a future he didn't realize I already controlled. He was busy being loudly ambitious, while I had spent the last 2 years building the very foundations he intended to colonize. Our divorce had been a clean, quick transaction, a necessary shedding of weight for a man who thought I was too small for the life he wanted. Now, watching him bask in the predatory admiration of his peers, I felt a flicker of the old regret, quickly smothered by a newer, sharper clarity. He saw a world of trophies and titles. I saw a map of vulnerabilities and strategic entries. I tightened my grip on my clutch and turned away before our eyes could meet again. I had a seat to find near the west wall and a role to play. Victor Kane wanted to stand beside power, never realizing that the power he craved was curtly smoothing down a navy blazer and walking quietly into the back of the room. Would you like me to proceed with Chapter 2, The Silent Partner, where Victor confronts Aria about her modest career? I didn't stop walking, but I felt the shift in the room's energy before I heard his footsteps. The polished marble floor of the Geneva summit echoed with a confidence that Victor Kane wore like a second skin. I reached the edge of the lounge, my hand grazing the back of an empty chair, when his voice cut through the ambient hum of hushed million-dollar deals. Aria, I thought I recognized that silhouette, though I expected you to be somewhere much less exclusive, he said, his tone carrying a familiar edge of calculated dismissal. I turned slowly, meeting his gaze with the calm, analytical stare that had become my greatest weapon. Victor looked exactly as he had 2 years ago. Charismatic, status-obsessed, and entirely convinced of his own gravity. He glanced down at the strategic observer tag pinned to my navy blazer, a small smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Strategic observer? Helix Global Holdings? He let out a soft, patronizing laugh that didn't reach his eyes. I see you're still playing it safe, Aria. Still hiding in the shadows of mid-level firms while the rest of us are actually shaping the market. It's a respectable little title, I suppose. Very modest. I didn't flinch. I had spent a decade watching him mistake volume for value, and 2 years realizing that his need to dim my light was the only way he could feel bright. I prefer to let the results speak for themselves, Victor, I replied, my voice steady and devoid of the defensive heat he was clearly fishing for. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as if offering a piece of pitying advice. You always were better suited for the background. Some people are built for the pressure of high-stakes acquisitions, and some people plateau. I told you back then, you think too small. I needed someone who could stand beside power, not someone who just watches it from the sidelines. He gestured vaguely toward the bar, where the elite heads of funds were still gathered, waiting for his keynote. Enjoy your observation, Aria. I'm sure it's much more comfortable than actually being in the line of fire. I watched him walk away, his shoulders squared with the victory of a man who thought he had just erased me in real time. He had no idea that the modest observer he just dismissed was the same person who had spent the last quarter quietly deconstructing his expansion strategy and recommending that Sebastian Laurent's firm acquire every target Victor was currently bragging about. I sat down and smoothed my blazer. The dinner was just beginning, and Victor was about to learn that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one speaking into the microphone. It's the one who already knows exactly what they're going to say. The chime of a crystal flute against a glass signaled the transition from the cocktail hour to the formal dinner, and the elite crowd began to migrate toward the dining hall with the synchronized grace of a school of sharks. I stood to follow, intent on finding the modest seat near the west wall that Theo's assistant had mentioned. I was halfway across the room when a young woman in a sharp black suit intercepted me, her face pale and her breathing shallow. "Miss Sterling?" "Aria Sterling," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the towering floral arrangements at the center of the room. I nodded, and she let out a frantic exhale. "I am so incredibly sorry. There's been a massive oversight with the seating chart. You aren't at the perimeter. You've been moved to the main table." Before I could protest or suggest that the west wall suited my anonymity much better, she was already guiding me toward the heart of the hall. This wasn't just any table. It was a long, obsidian-polished expanse positioned directly under the largest chandelier, reserved for primary investors and the evening speakers. As I took my seat, I recognized the faces flanking me, Alexander Roth and a handful of other men whose signatures moved global markets. And then I looked across the table. Victor was already seated, leaning back with proprietary air, flanked by two fund managers who looked like they were auditioning for his favor. The moment he saw me, his casual posture vanished. His spine stiffened, and his glass of scotch paused halfway to his lips. The mocking smirk he had worn in the lounge faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine confusion that he quickly masked with a scowl. "There must be another mistake," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by the surrounding power players. He didn't address me directly. He spoke to the table as if I were a glitch in the software. This section is reserved for the primary stakeholders of the emerging market funds. Aria is a guest of Theo's. An observer, Alexander Roth, the seasoned investor to my right, adjusted his glasses and looked at me with a calculating, sharp-eyed gaze. The seating was finalized by the host's office. Victor, if Ms. Sterling is here, it's because she belongs here. Victor's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He settled back into his chair, tried to regain his corporate alpha composure, but he couldn't stop staring. I could see him trying to rationalize it, convinced that my presence was a fluke or a desperate favor from Theo to help me find my footing. He sat directly in my line of sight, a constant reminder of the man who had dismissed me as a small thinker. I simply picked up my linen napkin and draped it across my lap, meeting his gaze with the cold, unblinking patience of a predator who had already won the hunt. The silence at the table stretched, heavy with the unspoken question of why a modest observer was sitting among the giants. The first course was served, a delicate arrangement of diverse scallops that looked more like art than sustenance, but the atmosphere at the table remained heavy with Victor's restless energy. He couldn't let my presence go. To him, the fact that I was sitting among the architects of the global economy was a glitch in the universe that he felt personally responsible for correcting. He set his fork down with a sharp clink, leaning forward with a look of practiced, mournful sincerity that I knew was the prelude to a character assassination disguised as concern. "I apologize if things seem a bit awkward," Victor said, his voice projecting just enough to capture the attention of Alexander Roth and the other three fund managers. He gave me a thin, tight smile, the kind a grown man gives a child who has wandered into a boardroom. Aria and I were married for 5 years. Seeing her here, well, it's a surprise for both of us. I imagine. I kept my gaze on my glass, watching the way the candlelight fractured through the water. I didn't give him the satisfaction of looking up. "Aria is a brilliant woman in her own way," Victor continued, his tone dripping with a kind of false kindness that is far more toxic than outright malice. "But the transition after the divorce hasn't been easy. When we were together, I handled the high-level strategies, the heavy lifting of the acquisitions. It can be quite a shock to the system when you're suddenly on your own, trying to navigate the deep end without a lifeguard." One of the younger investors at the end of the table tilted his head. "So, Helix Global is a transition firm for you, Miss Sterling?" Before I could breathe a word, Victor jumped back in, effectively erasing my voice. "Helix is a fine place to find one's footing. I've been encouraging Aria to take it slow. She's always had a very modest approach to the markets, very cautious, very small scale. I think it's wonderful that she's here tonight just to observe and learn from the way the real players operate. It's important to have goals, even if they're a bit out of reach for now." He reached across the corner of the table, momentarily placing his hand near mine in a gesture that looked like support to the strangers watching, but felt like a shackle to me. "Don't feel pressure to keep up with the conversation tonight, Aria. Just soak it in. These men are the best in the world at what they do." The table fell into a patronizing silence. I could feel the collective temperature of the room shift. I was no longer a peer to these men, but a charity case Victor was kindly sponsoring for the evening. He had effectively rebranded my silence as incompetence and my career as a hobby. He picked up his wine glass, looking immensely satisfied with himself, confident that he had put me back in the box he had built for me 2 years ago. I simply took a slow sip of my water, my face a mask of perfect, strategic calm. I knew what Victor didn't, that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one holding the most cards, and the man he was so eager to impress was exactly 20 minutes away from changing his life forever. The air in the ballroom suddenly shifted, losing its stagnant, patronizing weight as if a window had been thrown open to a gale. It began as a murmur near the entrance, a ripple of movement that caused heads to turn and conversations to fracture mid-sentence. Victor was still mid-anecdote, his hand raised in a self-important gesture, but he faltered when he noticed Alexander Roth's attention snap toward the doors. The silence followed, heavy and absolute, spreading to the hall until the only sound was a rhythmic, purposeful stride of polished leather against marble. Sebastian Laurent had arrived. He didn't just walk into the room. He rearranged its gravity. There was an old money magnetic presence to him that transcended the loud ambition of men like Victor. He was the kind of billionaire whose name was spoken in hushed tones behind closed doors, a man whose $12 billion empire was built on silence and surgical precision. He ignored the outstretched hands of fund managers and the desperate, hopeful nods of the city's elite. His gaze was fixed, narrow and predatory in its focus, scanning the room until it locked onto the main table. I felt Victor stiffen beside me, his posture shifting into something hungry and alert. He smoothed his tie, likely already rehearsing the pitch he would give to the most powerful man in the room. "Is that Laurent?" Victor whispered, his voice cracking with a rare moment of genuine awe. He began to stand, preparing to inject himself into Sebastian's orbit, convinced that the $12 billion man was heading toward him to discuss the emerging market panel. But Sebastian didn't stop at the head of the table. He didn't acknowledge the seasoned investors who were half rising from their seats in deference. He walked straight past Victor, his shadow momentarily eclipsing my ex-husband's stunned face. The room seemed to hold its breath as Sebastian reached my chair. The corporate alpha power dynamic that Victor had spent the last hour carefully constructing didn't just crack. It vanished. Sebastian didn't offer a polite nod or a professional greeting. Instead, he placed a firm, protective hand on my shoulder, a gesture of intimate, undisputed ownership and respect. "I apologize for the delay, Aria," Sebastian said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carried clearly across the silent table. He didn't look at the men around us. His eyes were only for me, filled with controlled warmth that felt like a shield. The board meeting at Helix ran long. "I hope these gentlemen haven't been taxing your patience too much." I looked up at him, my calm, analytical mask finally softening into a ghost of a smile. Across the table, Victor looked as if the floor had been pulled out from under his feet. His mouth hung slightly open, his hand still hovering near his tie, his eyes darting between Sebastian's hand on my shoulder and the strategic observer tag on my blazer. The silence stretched, long and excruciating, as the realization began to sink in for every man at the table. The woman they had spent the evening patronizing wasn't just a guest. She was the center of the gravity they were all currently orbiting. The silence at the table was no longer patronizing. It was paralyzed. Victor sat frozen, his hand still hovering near his silk tie, as if he'd forgotten how to move. The predatory confidence that had defined him all evening had evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. He stared at Sebastian's hand on my shoulder, then up at the man who was currently the most powerful force in the room, and finally at me. Sebastian didn't leave him in suspense for long. He pulled out the chair beside me, moving with a calm authority that made every other man at the table look like an amateur. He didn't look at the menu. He looked at the group, his gaze lingering on Victor with a cold, discerning edge that seemed to strip away my ex-husband's expensive facade. "I trust my wife hasn't been too bored by the small talk," Sebastian said, the word wife landing like a physical blow against Victor's chest. A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the nearby tables. Sebastian turned his head slightly, finally acknowledging Alexander Roth with a brief, professional nod before his focus returned to me. Aria has a habit of being far too polite when people underestimate her. It's one of her few flaws. Victor found his voice, though it was thin and lacked its usual resonance. "Wife, Aria, you're married Sebastian Laurent." Sebastian's smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a sharp, dangerous thing. For 14 months, though our personal life is rarely as interesting to the public as our professional one. He leaned back, draping an arm over the back of my chair, effectively centering the entire table's attention on me. "I assume you gentlemen were discussing the emerging market acquisitions? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, considering Aria is the one who built the analytical framework for Helix Global's entire European portfolio." The blood drained from Victor's face. The strategic observer tag he had mocked just moments ago suddenly looked like a badge of absolute authority. "She isn't just an observer, Victor," Sebastian continued, his voice dropping to a smooth, lethal silk. "Aria is the lead strategic analyst for Helix. Every deal I've signed in the last 2 years, every acquisition that has made headlines, passed through her hands first. In fact, She's a reason Helix is currently the lead bidder on the very tech firms your fund has been trying to court for months. I felt the shift in the room's atmosphere. I was no longer the ex-wife finding her footing or the small thinker who couldn't handle the pressure. I was the architect of the very empire Victor was trying to emulate. The men at the table, who had previously looked at me with pity, were now looking at me with a mix of terror and profound respect. Victor looked at me, his eyes searching mine for some sign of the woman he thought he knew, the one he thought he could diminish with a few well-placed barbs. But I only met his stare with a steady, unbreakable calm. I didn't need to say a word. Sebastian had provided the introduction, but the power in the room, the real, quiet, dominant power, had been mine all along. I simply picked up my wine glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the weight of the reveal settle over the table like a shroud. The small thinker had just become the biggest person in the room. The table was a landscape of frozen expressions, but Victor was the most shattered among them. He gripped the edge of the obsidian surface, his knuckles white, as he looked from Sebastian's proprietary hand on my shoulder to the calm, unwavering mass of my face. He looked like a man watching his entire reality reconfigure in real time, struggling to reconcile the small thinker he had discarded with a woman who now held the keys to the kingdom he so desperately wanted to enter. The expansion project, Victor stammered, his voice thin and desperate as he tried to pivot back to the only ground where he felt he had leverage. The emerging market initiative I'm heading. I'm presenting the keynote on it tonight. Surely, Aria, you've seen the projections. It's the most aggressive growth strategy in the sector. I set my wine glass down with a soft, deliberate click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. I didn't look at Sebastian. I looked directly at Victor, and for the first time that evening, I let the analytical coldness of my mind sharpen into a blade. I haven't just seen the projections, Victor. I've dismantled them, I said, my voice quiet but carrying a weight that silenced the neighboring tables. Helix Global was approached to lead the Series B funding for your initiative 6 months ago. The file sat on my desk for 3 days. I'm the one who issued the red flag memorandum that killed your funding. Victor's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The fund managers around us leaned in, their professional curiosity finally overriding their shock. Your strategy relies on a 12% overhead reduction in volatile markets that haven't seen a stability index above 0.4 in a decade. I continued, the numbers flowing with a lethal, effortless precision. You mistook loud ambition for intelligence, Victor. You over-leverage your primary assets to chase a headline-grabbing expansion while ignoring the foundational rot in your supply chain. It's a textbook case of poor execution. I leaned forward slightly, my gaze unblinking. While you were busy telling this table that I was finding my footing, the portfolios I've been managing for Helix closed the fiscal year with a 32% return rate. I didn't achieve that by being cautious or modest. I achieved it by being right. I saw the flaws in your big projects because I was the one building the systems that eventually outpaced them. Alexander Roth let out a short, sharp huff of a laugh, a sound of genuine professional admiration. A 32% return in this climate? Good God. Kane, you weren't kidding when you said she was brilliant. You just failed to mention she was the one eating your lunch. Victor looked as if he had been struck. The corporate alpha, who had spent the evening patronizing me, was now just a man whose biggest failure had been aired in front of the very peers he worshipped. He looked down at his plate, the scallops now cold and forgotten, as the gravity of the room finished its rearrangement. I wasn't just beside power. I was the intelligence that directed it, and Victor was finally seeing the empire I had built while he was busy looking for trophies. The gala's closing notes hummed in the distance, but the air near the heavy mahogany exit doors was sharp and still. I stepped toward the valet stand, the weight of the evening finally lifting, when a shadow detached itself from the stone pillars. It was Victor. He looked diminished, the predatory sharpness of his tailored suit now appearing like a costume that no longer fit. The corporate alpha had been replaced by a man haunted by the math of his own arrogance. "Aria, wait," he said, his voice stripped of the patronizing timbre he'd used at the dinner table. He didn't approach with his usual swagger. He stood at a distance, as if finally sensing the boundary I had drawn 2 years ago. "I didn't know. About Helix. About Sebastian. I thought you were I thought I was protecting you by leaving you out of the chaos of my world. I stopped, turning slowly. I didn't feel the heat of anger or the sting of the old humiliation. I felt only the profound, quiet clarity of someone who had seen the bottom of glass and realized it was empty. I watched him struggle to find the right expression, his face contorting into a mask of regret that looked as rehearsed as his keynote speech. "I made a mistake," he whispered, stepping into the light of the street lamps. His eyes were wide, searching mine for a flicker of the woman who used to wait for his approval. 2 years ago, I was blind. I thought I needed someone who mirrored my ambition, but I see now that I walked away from the only person who actually understood the game. We were a team. Aria, we could be again. I can fix the project. With your insight, with the Helix backing. You didn't make a mistake, Victor. I interrupted, my voice as calm as the alpine air. The words weren't a strike. They were a postmortem. A mistake is a decimal point out of place, or a misflight. What you did was make a choice. You chose to value flash over substance. You chose to believe that because I didn't shout, I had nothing to say. You chose to see my silence as a void instead of strategy. He flinched, the word choice hanging between us like a physical barrier. He reached out a hand, then pulled it back, realizing the small thinker he had discarded was now the architect of the very world he was begging to inhabit. "I thought I was moving up," he stammered. "You were moving toward an image," I replied. "And, in the process, you chose to erase the person who was actually building the foundation. You don't get to call it a mistake just because the person you devalued turned out to be the one holding the leverage. You liked the version of me that was modest and quiet because it made you feel louder. But I was never small, Victor. I was just patient." The valet pulled Sebastian's car to the curb, a dark, understated masterpiece of engineering that didn't need a roar to be noticed. I took a single step toward the door, leaving Victor standing in the shadows of the entrance. He looked like a man who had finally realized he hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the only person who truly knew how to win. I didn't look back to see if he was still watching. I had spent enough time being a background character in his life. It was time to drive away into my own. The city lights of Geneva blurred into long, shimmering streaks of silver and gold as the dark sedan glided away from the summit hall. Inside the car, the silence was a living thing, but it wasn't heavy or pressurized like the air in the ballroom. It was a comfortable, expansive quiet that allowed the adrenaline of the evening to finally recede. Sebastian sat behind the wheel, his hands relaxed but steady, his profile a study in calm strength against the passing glow of the street lamps. I leaned my head back against the soft leather, closing my eyes for a moment. The image of Victor standing alone in the shadows of the entrance lingered, but no longer held any power over me. For 2 years, I had carried the silent weight of his dismissal, the phantom echo of him telling me I thought too small for his world. I had spent tonight expecting to feel a sense of vindication because Sebastian had walked in and tilted the world on its axis. But as the distance between us and the summit grew, a different realization began to take root. "You didn't have to do that," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper in the hushed cabin. The reveal, the introduction. I could have handled the walk to the valet alone. Sebastian didn't take his eyes off the road, but a small, knowing smile touched his lips. "I know you could have, Aria. That's exactly why I did it. You spent so long being the smartest person in the room, while letting everyone else believe they were in charge. I didn't walk into that room to save you from them. I walked in because I wanted them to see what I see every single day." He reached across the center console, his fingers interlacing with mine. His grip was warm, grounded, and entirely devoid of the proprietary arrogance Victor had always used. "Victor didn't see you because he was too busy looking at himself," Sebastian continued, his tone devoid of judgment, stating a simple fact. "He thought you needed his light to be visible. He never realized that you were the one generating the power for the entire building." I looked out the window at the dark expanse of Lake Geneva, the water reflecting the moon with a quiet, hidden depth. In that moment, the narrative I had been telling myself for 2 years shifted. I had spent so much time proving my worth through 32% returns and strategic acquisitions, waiting for a moment where the world, or a man like Sebastian, would validate that I was enough, but looking at my reflection in the glass, I realized the truth. Sebastian hadn't rescued me from humiliation. He had simply provided the stage for a truth I had already authored. He hadn't given me my power. He had merely recognized it. He was the partner I had built a foundation for, not because I was small, but because I was large enough to share an empire without losing myself in it. The car hummed as we sped toward home, leaving the ghosts of the past in the rearview mirror. Some women spend their lives waiting for a billionaire to walk into a room and change their story. I realized then that I didn't need a rescue. I only needed a man who understood that I had already rescued myself, long before he ever arrived. I wasn't just a partner to a billionaire. I was a strategist in my own life, and for the first time, the small thinker felt absolutely, undeniably extraordinary.